All right, moving on to chapter 14. Chapter 14, we're going to be looking at psychological disorders. Here again, we're going to be relating this to another course. This has got a lot of information that you're going to find in your abnormal psychology course. So if you've taken that class, there's a lot of stuff in here that's already going to be really familiar to you, and you're going to breeze through this chapter. If you haven't, you're going to get introduced to a lot of material that's going to help you to do great in that abnormal psychology course that's coming up. So, psychological disorder. So a lot of this is going to be compressed of what would be in that course. So we're not going to spend as much time on it as we would, of course, when we have the whole semester to spend on it. When we look at psychological disorders, there's different ways that we look at abnormal behavior and mental illness. It's sometimes a challenge so we have to categorize it. And the reason is we all go through stuff. We've all been depressed. We've all been anxious. We've all been insert situation here. But what happens is, when does it move to the level that we would say is a mental illness? And so we have to find a way to categorize that. So the easiest and the clearest way to do so is to use the medical model. And that's the predominant way in which we use to diagnose and categorize. So we know what to better understand, so how we can help a person through those struggles. And it doesn't mean that they won't have struggles. It just means it may or may not move to the degree of classification. However, when we look at classification at any given time, any 25% or 1 in 4 people will be suffering from some sort of mental illness. And we shouldn't fear mental illness. There are certainly awarenesses that we need to have, but we should understand that this can be part of people's lives, and it can be something we work through for certain. So the medical model is the most common classifying way to look at how we classify these abnormal behaviors and put them into categories that are considered a disease. So it's saying that this imbalance, this abnormal behavior, imbalance of behavior is considered a disease. And this helps to guide treatment, and it also helps to get rid of these stigmas. Stigmas of things like people are possessed, or that people are choosing certain things. Somebody may not be choosing to be depressed, that kind of thing. So it helps with that. And it leads to distinguishing criteria, so we can distinguish one disease from another. So why do we say it's this over that? So we're going to look at those criteria and classifications in this chapter. We also have to determine if the behavior is really abnormal, or is it just the way they are. So some people may be cleaner than others. Does that mean they're OCD? Well, we have to look at what's happening with that. Some people may be messier than others. Does that mean that they're schizophrenic, or are they just messy? So there's different. Some people are super happy, and some people are just kind of not as happy. Again, how do we classify that? So things that we would look for is it a deviant behavior? Is it outside of the norms societally when they from where they have been grown up? Is it maladaptive? And does it cause them personal distress? So those are 3 areas that we would look at. Is it deviant? Is it maladaptive? And is it causing personal stress? Again, the line can be very hard. And it may be very difficult as we look at, like, is it causing me distress? Well, it's causing me distress on Tuesday, but as soon as I resolved it on Wednesday, it's not. So if it's very limited or not that intense, then we probably would not classify it as a mental illness. So, being anxious about a test versus being anxious about every test, and it affects my ability to perform, sleep, or do things. 2 different categories. So the first thing we are going to look at is anxiety disorders. They are the most common and most prevalent disorder that we do see. This classification of disorders are marked by feelings of excessive apprehension and anxiety. Approximately 19% of the population will experience an anxiety or anxiety disorder. And they're, again, the most common type of disorder that we would find. And there's different types of anxiety disorders. The first one is a generalized anxiety disorder. And this is a chronic condition where the person experiences high level of anxiety, and it's not tied to a particular threat. They are always nervous. They are always worrying. The phobic disorder follows in this category as well, where it's a persistent and irrational fear of an object or situation that realistically doesn't present a threat. A fear of spiders. They're probably not coming after you, but we are fear, and it's a very real experience for them. A fear of heights, a fear of speaking in public. They tend to be irrational, but they're very real fears for those that are experiencing them. Panic disorders come in this category, including agoraphobia. And these are recurrent attacks of overwhelming anxiety that will occur suddenly and unexpectedly. 2/3 of the people who suffer from panic disorders are females. And agoraphobia is the fear of going into public places, and some people will not even be willing to leave their homes. OCD, you may have heard about that, which is obsessive compulsive disorder, which is a persistent, uncontrolled intrusion of unwanted thoughts and urges, and they typically will lead to a senseless ritual that they think is going to somehow keep them safer. So, hand washing, excessive cleaning, double checking, whatever that might be, counting. The onset for OCD is typically before the age of 30. We do know that looks like there may be a genetic link in many cases for anxiety. It doesn't mean because somebody in your family had it, you will get it. It just means that you may have a higher likelihood of being affected by it. We also know that those that are timid or shy are more likely to be affected by anxiety disorders. With that said, a lot of it is conditioned. A lot of anxieties are taught through either unintentional or intentional, usually not intentional, but it deliberately happened, experiences. So it could be a bad experience you had, such as falling from a height could make you afraid of heights, that type of thing, or where you watched or heard of somebody else's experiences. So you were afraid of snakes because you heard bad things about snakes and you saw other people afraid of snakes. Therefore, you convinced yourself, very young usually, that was a threat and that you needed to be afraid of them. So snakes, spiders, things like that, those are things that we tend to have taught those fears or learned those fears from someone. Moving on to the dissociative disorders, which are very different. This is where a person loses contact with portions of their consciousness and their memory, creating a disturbed or disrupted identity. So these are a lot less common, probably more common on TV and in movies than they are in real life. Not to say it doesn't happen. Fortunately, when it does happen, it is usually temporary as well. The most common one we would see would be dissociative amnesia, and that's the sudden loss of a memory from an important personal information that is too extensive to be normal forgetting. This would be common after a huge trauma, especially if that trauma involved a physical trauma as well as a psychological impact. So this would be something like combat, rape, assault, maybe a car accident, something like that. So there was a lot, and it was just too much for us to take in at once. And typically, again, it would be temporary, and even if it isn't temporary, it tends to start to resolve itself. Most of the areas may resolve themselves. Another area of a dissociative disorder, which is very controversial, is called dissociative identity disorder, often referred to as DID. This involves the coexistence in one person of two or more largely complete and very different personalities. It used to be called multiple personality disorder. And again, this is very controversial. There are many theories, studies, and ideas out there that it does not exist, yet it does persist in the DSM stating that it could be out there. It was not common where this person would split and actually become two different people, but it is still out there. Another category or another area to look at is the mood disorder. Mood disorders are marked by emotional disturbances that can spill over into physical, perceptual, and thought process problems. The most common of those is major depressive disorder. Here, the person experiences a persistent feeling of sadness or despair, typically coupled with a loss of interest in things that used to be a source of pleasure to them. It is very common. While anxiety is the most common, it's up to 16% of the people will experience major depressive episodes. Typically, the first episode happens before 40, and a person will typically face 5 to 6 of these episodes throughout their lifetimes. When they do have a depressive episode, the common time would be at least 6 months for them to be going through this period of depression. It is more common in women than in men. Another area here is the bipolar disorder, much less common than the major depressive disorder. This is where the person goes through fluctuating periods between depression and manic behavior, affecting about 1% of the population, and it does affect both men and women. Here in bipolar disorder, we do see genetic links again, not guaranteeing that you would have it, but if someone in your family has it, there would be a higher likelihood that you could suffer from it. It can also have some learned influences, such as a learned helplessness that might be attached to it. And major stressors tend to be a trigger for these events. Moving on, schizophrenic disorders are a disruption of thought that spill over into the effect of the perceptual, social, and emotional process. About 1% of the population would be affected by schizophrenia, and this typically will have its first occurrence or start to show itself in adolescence or young adulthood. This again is a much rarer disorder, affecting only about 1% of the population. Common symptoms that we would see in somebody suffering from schizophrenia include irrational thoughts, a person becoming out of touch with reality, deterioration of adaptive behavior, distorted perceptions, hallucinations, and disruptions of emotions. There are 4 subtypes of schizophrenia, 4 categories we would look at. Those include paranoid schizophrenia, catatonia, disorganized schizophrenia, and undifferentiated schizophrenia. And again, those will be addressed more in your abnormal psych class, those 4 different classifications. This disorder of schizophrenia is one that we do commonly see a stronger genetic link to. Again, not meaning you will have it if somebody has it, but it is not uncommon to find somebody within a family system, if somebody has it, that somebody else in the family also had it. We do see this as related to a neurochemical imbalance or brain abnormalities. And there are some theories out there that brain trauma, particularly that around birth or pre-birth, may be an influence in schizophrenia development. Eating disorders, or another category here, which is a severe disturbance in eating characterized by the preoccupation with weight and unhealthy effort to control the weight. Anorexia nervosa is the most common that we hear about. And here the person has a fear of gaining weight. They have a distorted body image, and they may refuse to maintain a normal weight, often resulting in dangerous loss of weight. This is considered a very serious disease and can cause death in 5 to 10% of the people who are afflicted with it. It puts a lot of damage onto the body. Bulimia is another common eating disorder that we do see, which is out of control overeating, followed by vomiting, fasting, diuretics or laxatives, or excessive exercise to get rid of the food or the caloric intake that they took in. Binge eating is the third, and in binge eating, what you're going to see is that binging behavior, however, is not accompanied by purging. Eating disorders are much more common in women, although they do affect men. So those are the common disorders. And again, a lot of that material should be reviewed for those of you who've already taken abnormal. If you haven't, know that we will spend more time on that, really looking at those disorders and how they affect us in that class. One more chapter to go. See you very soon, and we're going to look at psychotherapy.